If you work across time zones, borders, and cultures, this is the show for you. This is Leonardo, host of the International Business Podcast. Today, we discuss about the split between China and the US. Last month, I read the book The Split by Shaun Rein. He offers a critical analysis of the evolving economic landscape in China against the backdrop of rising tensions with the United States. As China reopens its doors to global business, Shaun, an American who has lived in China for over 25 years, provides invaluable insights into how companies can navigate this complex environment. He argues that while some sectors may face challenges due to geopolitical shifts, significant opportunities still exist in non-politically sensitive areas. The book emphasizes the importance of understanding China's policy changes and consumer behavior to capitalize on long-term growth potential, as it is poised to become the world's largest economy. I have to say that I've enjoyed this book more than his previous one, The End of Cheap China. Shaun is the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, CMR, the world's leading strategic market intelligence firm focused on China. He works with boards, billionaires, heads of states, CEOs, and senior executives of Fortune 500 and leading Chinese companies, private equity firms, SMEs, and long hedge funds to develop their China growth, political, and investment strategies. For detailed information about Shaun, please check the show notes.
The world is stuck in a hard place. They are stuck in a split between the two world's great superpowers, the United States and China. Unfortunately, the United States, under Biden and now even under Trump, is not going to allow China to rise and gain too much influence because America wants to maintain American hegemony and its place at the top of what Anthony Blinken calls the rules-based world order. The result is the United States is trying to contain China, a la George Kennan in the 1940s and 50s with the Soviet Union. When the Chinese get strong at anything, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's telecom, whether it's cotton, whether it's antibiotics, whether it's solar panel, the Americans scream out national security risk, unfair trade practices, or China is using slave labor or committing genocide in order to manufacture products cheaply. The result is the United States, more than China even, are forcing countries and thus companies to decide, do you want to get closer to the United States' economic orbit, or do you want to get close to China's economic orbit? It is very difficult for countries to be able to do robust trade with both. We've seen Singapore, we've seen New Zealand try to thread the needle, but the reality is most countries are ending up like Japan, which has gone all in and moving closer to America's orbit. Same thing with the South Koreans. And they're lowering their investment into China. And they're also selling fewer and fewer of their products into the Chinese supply chain. The United States is also threatening companies in Japan, South Korea, all the way to the Netherlands with ASML and Taiwan with TSMC and semiconductors, not to sell their high-end technology to China. So companies have to decide, do they want to get close to China or do they want to get close to the United States? Now, the global south clearly is moving closer to the Chinese. Saudi Arabia is launching huge business parks and tech parks with the Chinese. I was just there with my son, Shaun Rein, who makes drones, and we saw Alibaba and Huawei signs all over the place. Countries like Kenya, Thailand, are all moving closer to China and the global south. So going forward over the next 5-10 years, countries and companies are going to have to decide, do you want to bet on your growth revenue coming from China or coming from the United States? Because it's going to be very difficult to sell to both. Now, this also means that everyday consumers are not immune to this geopolitical tension, unfortunately. It's not coincidental that when Trump initiated unprovoked the trade war against China in 2017, that we've seen massive inflation over the last 7 years in Western Europe and the United States due to a mix of low energy because of the Ukraine-Russia war, but really a large part of it has come from tariffs. And if Trump does indeed want to slap 60% tariffs on Chinese-made goods, as he said he would during the election process, then inflation is going to come even more to places like in Walmart or Target to everyday American consumers. So this split between the US and China is not something that any country, any company, any consumer, any individual in the world can run away from. It's here to stay. So I wrote my book, The Split, in order to help companies understand how best should you navigate China's changes, China's new regulations, and the geopolitical tension to still potentially profit in China.
Diversifying supply chains or creating a China plus one supply chain strategy is key to reducing political risk from the United States, and in case there is another massive event, such as COVID, creating havoc with shipping lanes. Some analysts argue that Vietnam or India is the next China.
Many pundits argue that India is the next major growth market for the world. Now, India is a great market, and when we advise our multinational clients and when we advise our institutional investors like hedge funds and mutual funds, we do say that they should gain more exposure to India. I mean, you would be crazy not to get exposure to a country that's growing 6.8, 6.9% a year and which has 1.4 billion customers. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, China is the next China. If China were to continue to grow at just 5% a year over the next 3 to 5 years, that would be like adding an entire Vietnam and an entire Thai economy to China. So scale matters. At the end of the day, multinationals should be looking at China for its major growth trigger. We expect that China to account for about a third of economic growth over the next 3 to 5 years, especially in smaller tier cities. You know, in cities like Changsha or Xi'an or Zhengzhou. These might be cities that most Americans have never heard of, but they've got populations the size of 10 million people, and they're still growing. They're actually outgrowing first-tier cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. So they're a great growth market for multinationals. Now, when it comes to India, absolutely. We totally recommend that companies and investors gain more exposure to India. But at the end of the day, people have to remember that per capita, India's GDP is only 1/5 that of China's. So it's going to take 20, 30, 40, 50 years for India to catch up to China's total global economic size. Now, I think part of the problem with why people are depressed or anxious in China is they're just not seeing the same growth that they were used to 10, 15 years ago. In those days, salaries would grow 20, 30% a year. Housing prices would grow 20, 30% a year. So essentially, Chinese expected to double their net worths every 2 to 3 years. Now, in the post-COVID era, China's economy is weak. Let me be very clear about it. It's definitely weak, but the economy is still growing about 5%. It's just that consumers and business owners were accustomed and hoping for a return to the 20, 30% growth that they saw in the 2010s before Trump became president in 2016. But the reality is that type of economic growth was unsustainable. It created a lot of bubbles. It wasn't the most economically efficient. There was too much investment going into infrastructure and into housing that frankly wasn't needed, especially when there's an aging population like there is now. So at the end of the day, China is the next China. If you're a multinational, if you are an investor, it would be a real mistake to bet against the world's second largest economy with the largest retail market, because China has not just the infrastructure and the manufacturing ecosystem that's unrivaled anywhere else in the world, but importantly, they have the rise of the middle class. There are about 400 million Chinese in the middle class, and we expect at the China Market Research Group that number to expand to 800 million in the next 5 to 10 years. When you look at the policies coming from Xi Jinping and the CPC, initiatives like Common Prosperity, you can see that all of their initiatives are aimed towards growing the wealth by getting access to medical care, by getting access to education, by increasing income for low and middle class Chinese. So over the next 5 to 10 years, absolutely, companies and investors should look at other countries like in India or Vietnam. But at the end of the day, China is going to be where their major growth is.
If you're looking for more, check out the subscriber-only feed. For the cost of 1 cup of coffee per month, you'll gain access to the full archive and bonus subscriber-only episodes, in addition to the regular ones. Check the link in the description. The days of easy profits are gone as China faces a slowing economy and an aging growth model. Now the government is focusing on new productive forces.
Since China's economic opening up and reforms in 1978, China has had a growth playbook that has worked miraculously well and has really uplifted 800 million Chinese out of poverty. And that playbook was based off of infrastructure building and real estate. So you see, most people lived in ramshackle homes. They used to have to share bathrooms in the 1970s and 80s. Even into the 1990s, a lot of people had to share bathrooms. But that all changed when China started emphasizing investment into real estate and infrastructure. And it's worked wonders. When you take a subway in mainland China, it's cheap, it's clean, it's fast. It's, a century ahead of whatever you get in the United States. I mean, when you go back into New York, it's absolutely disgusting when you compare it to China. I mean, I own my own cars and I drive myself, but whenever I have the opportunity, I actually take China's public transportation, like subways, like high-speed rails, because it's just that much better than driving my own car. However, we're starting to reach a point where there isn't that much efficiency economically or a return on investment from the continued infrastructure build. I mean, they've really gone everywhere. I was in Tibet a few years ago, and I was told my team I might not be able to email them or I might not be able to talk to them on the phone because the last time I had been in Tibet, way back in 2001, the place was dirt poor. There was dirt roads everywhere. But when I went back just recently, I was at 4,800 meters up. The road systems, the highways there were better than any in the United States. And even at 4,800 meters high in the sky, I was able to do video chats on WeChat with my employees and family back in Shanghai. I actually had better interconnection there than I did in Sydney, in downtown Sydney, when I was there in October to keynote an investor conference there. So the infrastructure spend in China has been absolutely incredible, but we're starting to run into an aging growth playbook. We're not getting the return on equity, return on investment like we did before, because there's just frankly nowhere else really to build except for maybe in provinces like Xinjiang. So China's had to pivot, and they're looking for new growth drivers, which Xi Jinping and the CPC called new productive forces. This would be investment into high-end manufacturing like aerospace, into new energy vehicles, solar panels. This is high-end. And so when you see it, it's starting to work. Over 50% of new auto sales in 2024 have been to Chinese NEV makers like Xiaomi, Li Xiang, or NIO. And it's actually starting to cause massive problems for the legacy automakers, like a GM, like a Ford, like a Nissan, like a Toyota, like a Volkswagen, like a Porsche. Frankly, many of these companies are facing 40, 50% year-on-year drops in sale. And I'm not sure they're going to be able to compete and still exist in China in the next 5 to 10 years. So you're seeing that shift towards what Xi Jinping has coined new productive forces. However, it's going to be very difficult for these new productive forces to take up the slack of the revenue or economic growth from real estate and infrastructure, because that was so much more widespread, hired so many more workers. Like autos in China are largely automated, which is why it's ridiculous when you hear, the Biden regime say that China's done well in auto production because of forced labor. Because if you've been into any factories in China, most of the factories are automated. So there's very little humans actually on the production lines right now. But it's not going to be an easy shift. And that's why you're seeing the country is stagnating a little bit economically. It's definitely weak. It's going to take 3 to 5 years, maybe longer, for China to make that pivot. And that would be in an ideal geopolitical situation. But it's not an ideal political situation because you have the Americans and, the Europeans who are trying to contain China's economic rise out of xenophobia and out of fear mongering, I think. To me, China's growth is not a zero-sum game. And I think the people of the United States, Europe, China, India, everywhere would do better if there was more free trade and more economic cooperation. That would net have a benefit on humanity. But China's definitely going to struggle over the next few years as they switch their growth playbooks.
China is currently grappling with significant internal pressures. In response to these structural challenges, the government has shifted its focus towards socialism and intensified patriotic initiatives.
There's definitely been a shift towards more socialism the last 4 or 5 years under Xi Jinping than in his first 5 years as chairman of the party, and certainly more so than during the Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao eras. During Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, they were really focused more pragmatically on the economy. At the end of the day, they just wanted Chinese to be able to eat, have a roof over their heads, and have their kids be able to go to school or get medical care. Under Xi Jinping, he's really pivoted towards more socialism. I think part of it is to convince the population and condition them the reality that the go-go days of the early 2000s and 2000 teens are gone. I think Xi Jinping and the party realized that the 8, 9, 10, 12% growth rate of those days, where people were getting 20 to 30% salary increases, are a thing of the past and not sustainable. So I think he wanted to propagandize the entire country to realize, let's sort of lower our expectations for wealth creation. But I also think he is more of a socialist than the previous two presidents. And I think he believes less in the trickle-down effect economically that Hu Jintao believed in or allowed to run rampant in the country. And he's focused more on improving the lives of low-income and middle-class Chinese. And that's why you see a push towards common prosperity. That's why you see most of the new investments or stimulus measures are geared towards helping poor Chinese. Again, I think long term, this is going to swell the ranks of middle-class Chinese from 400 million to 800 million. And that's why certain sectors are going to get hit. Frankly, I think it's going to be rougher for high-end automobiles like a BMW or a Mercedes in the coming years. Porsche's in a lot of trouble right now as Chinese consumers trade down to Chinese NEV makers like a Xiaopeng or Li Xiang because of the weak economy. But I also think overall that sort of wealth class, the wealthy 10% of society, which currently power about 60% of consumption, is going to drop. And the real slack is going to come from the low middle class growth. And they're going to account for about 55% of overall consumption over the next 10 years. Now, in the short term, they're spending a lot of money on cheaper drinks. So think Luckin Coffee rather than Starbucks. Think Anta rather than Nike. Think traveling domestically to places like Tibet, Xizang, or to Xinjiang rather than going overseas to the United Kingdom or to France. So I think the name of the game for investors in 2024 and as we move into 2025 will be good value, cheap plays. It's about trading down. Now, in some sectors, consumers will trade up, and that's especially in sectors like outdoor apparel and sports apparel. I think in many ways, the new luxury in China is not toting a Gucci or a Louis Vuitton handbag. It's about being able to go out and exercise and show off that you're fit and healthy, which is why sales of Lululemon, Hoka shoes, On shoes are doing very well. I think companies need to understand that just saying you're a Western brand, saying you have a lot of heritage, saying you have a lot of craftsmanship is not enough anymore, but is no longer true in China. You need to make sure that you have the right brand position and right everything going forward, because Chinese consumers are trying to get their dollars to last a little bit more, and they're really trying to make a lot of money.
The US is way ahead of China in the semiconductor business. China is way ahead of the US when it comes to refining rare earths. Then we have AI, a battleground between democracies and autocracies.
Historically, there are really several ways that a country can dominate and be a superpower. One of them is by having the largest, best equipped military for conventional warfare. But as you see going forward, more and more warfare is going to be economic, but also importantly, it's going to be technologically. Now, on the economic side, one of the ways that China is able to withstand pressure from the United States is by continuing to be the world's factory. If they control the supply chains, they're able to turn off exports to the United States if there is a war. So it's sort of a balance of power. It's a way to keep everybody in check. But one of the most powerful ways that going forward that countries are going to be able to maintain its power is by having technological superiority. Now, when it comes to semiconductors, frankly, right now, the United States is in charge. They're probably 3 to 5 years ahead of China when it comes to semiconductor production. Now, a lot of people say that China can't catch up. I don't agree with that. China has more STEM graduates in the world every year than the United States. They've got the capital and they've got the government support. So I think it would be bigoted or racist to say that Chinese, just because they're Chinese or because they're living in a communist system, won't be able to catch up to the Americans when it comes to semiconductor innovation. Now, when it comes to the second sector in technology that's important, that's going to be AI. Artificial intelligence is one of the next great battlegrounds. That's why you have people like Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, who's been spreading xenophobia by saying that we need, as Americans, to defeat China in AI because it's an autocracy and the Chinese essentially threaten America's way of life. Now, I think a lot of those fear-mongering or attacks on China are highly exaggerated. But what's really important is that China's not that far behind, if they are far behind at all, from the United States when it comes to AI. You know, there's ChatGPT and OpenAI, but the reality is whoever's going to win AI is going to come from data. And the Chinese companies like Tencent and Alibaba have more data on us in a more concentrated format, a consolidated format than the Americans with Facebook, Instagram, and all over the place. So I actually think that the models coming out of China for AI are incredible. And they're going to catch up very quickly and be on par, if not exceed, the AI algorithms that are being produced in the United States in the next 2 to 3 years. And I think China understands that in order to be a powerful nation, it needs to have a strong military, it needs to have a strong economy, but at the end of the day, power over the next 10, 20, 30 years is going to be from controlling technology standards and having the best of breed technology, which is why the government is moving in force to invest so much into semiconductors, and why they're having the state and state-owned enterprises and government ministries work in tandem with private Chinese companies like Tencent and Alibaba at creating the next greatest AI models. And that's also one of the reasons why I think you've seen over the last year or two less of a crackdown on technology companies. You know, the crackdown on Alibaba is over, essentially, because the government wants these tech players to know you can still survive, but you need to be below the party. But importantly, you need to work with the party in creating the best of breed technology standards, both in semiconductors and AI, because that's a national security imperative for the Chinese.
Instead of dismantling Huawei and the broader Chinese technology sector, sanctions on semiconductor exports to China have, in fact, compelled the government and private enterprises to collaborate more closely and invest in research and development in areas where they previously felt secure, relying on American or European suppliers. These restrictions have prompted a significant shift in strategy, pushing Chinese firms to innovate and enhance their domestic capabilities.
Trump, launched his trade war against China, which was a mistake. But I think the bigger mistake was when Biden doubled down on Trump's trade war instead of resetting relations, and he actually increased the number of sanctions on Chinese companies. I think before Biden doubled down on the Trump-era sanctions and tariffs, the Chinese were hoping to get back to normal business. That would mean buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American technology every year from companies like Qualcomm, like Texas Instruments. I mean, before the Biden regime, 67% of Qualcomm's revenue derived from mainland China. 44% of Texas Instruments revenue derived from mainland China. But I think after Biden made it clear that he viewed China not just as an economic threat, but as an ideological one. I think, he viewed the world in black and white. American power versus China power. importantly, a liberal democracy versus a communist party. And Biden, with his high walls and small gardens, which I really view as high walls and large gardens, has tried to contain China and maybe destabilize that. As a result, the Chinese have really focused on indigenous innovation, and that's never going to end. Basically, Biden, in my mind, shot American technology in the foot with these sanctions. I mean, you look at it right now, ASML, which is a Dutch company, which is no longer allowed to sell its top-end technology to China. Their revenue, 20% comes from China, and their stock has really been hit hard in the last couple months. Even worse would be what's happened to Intel. Once the iconic American technology figure is tottering on bankruptcy. They've had to fire thousands of people, and they've now become a takeover target by Qualcomm because they're not able to sell their high-end technology to American companies. So Biden has really shot America in the foot. The Chinese companies now are spending a ton of money, tons of resources and time into bolstering the Chinese semiconductor sector. And it's not just Chinese semiconductors, it's the entire supply chain. I think it's very clear, and I have this in the opening chapter of my book, where a American technology company sold technology to Chinese firms and then pulled it out, even though the Chinese had paid, because they were worried that the Americans would sanction them for selling high-end technology to China. And they pulled it out. So basically right now is, even if Trump or the next president were to ease some of the tariffs and sanctions on China, I don't think America will ever get China back as a lucrative market in my lifetime, because Chinese companies know they can just no longer rely on America in the supply chain. And even on Western Europe, frankly, if they were to buy Western European products, what would happen in 2 years or 3 years if you have a harsh China hawk who becomes the prime minister or the chancellor or the president of Germany or France or the UK and decides we just want to, quote unquote, de-risk from China and no longer sell our top-end technology. So basically, the world's technology companies are all going to be hampered by what Trump and especially what Biden has done by stopping or making the Chinese not trust buying outside technology. China is really focused on indigenous innovation and being able to do everything on their own, self-sufficiency. And so it's not just technology. It also comes down to beef. It comes down to coffee. It comes down to fruit. It comes down to rice. You can see in sector after sector, the Chinese are building up their own supply chains to be able to parry off potential future attacks from the United States.
Based on over 10,000 interviews with government officials, senior executives, billionaires, and everyday Chinese consumers conducted over the past 30 years, Shaun's firm CMR has gathered a solid understanding of what is happening and what might happen in China.
10 years ago, all multinationals needed to be investing into China. Even though there was political risk from the Chinese side, uncertain laws, uneven regulation, the market was too valuable, too large, too potentially lucrative for Western businesses that you had to be in China. That's no longer the case anymore. As my book, The Split, outlines, for some sectors, you really shouldn't be in China. And that should probably be technology sectors, like semiconductors, because you're going to be stuck between a rock and a hard place between both the Chinese and the American governments. The American governments might sanction you or prevent you from selling into China, and the Chinese will allow you to invest, but they might not buy your products because they're worried that 2-3 years from now, they won't be able to continue to buy your products and services, which is what happened in the semiconductor sector. So because of the political risk, which I think is going to be generational, if you're in technology, China probably isn't a good sector for you to be in. But in less politically risky sectors, things like sports apparel, cosmetics, footwear, apparel, China really remains the next China. It's going to be a major growth driver for companies like Zara, like Hoka, like Lululemon, companies that are able to really understand the trend changes and the wants of Chinese consumers and who are going to be able to continue to invest. When you look at it, since China ended its zero COVID policy, some American and European companies, frankly, haven't done well in China. Companies like Nike. But the companies that have continued to invest in the country, companies like Adidas, companies like Lululemon, companies like Ralph Lauren that are building up huge new flagships, launching marketing campaigns specifically targeting the Chinese market, they're doing very well because they are able to compete against fast-growing domestic Chinese brands, and they're able to create good value and a strong brand proposition for the end customer. So I think basically multinationals need to become political risk experts. They need to know, should they even be in China from a political risk standpoint? But then if they are able to be in China, they need to move fast and be closer to the market more than ever before and really understand what their end customer or their end consumer really wants. Because if they don't know it, and if they're not willing to invest the money, if they're not willing to move and understand the Chinese consumer, they're going to get killed. They're not going to do well because you have well-capitalized, well-run, very ambitious local Chinese companies that are going to take away your market share. I mean, you look at a company like Starbucks, which is falling off the face of the earth because they're being outcompeted by domestic coffee brands like Luckin Coffee. You're having companies like Nike that are getting outcompeted by Chinese sports apparel brands like Anta and Be My. You're having the cosmetic companies like Estee Lauder getting outcompeted by Proya. So, if these companies had truly understood what was happening in the market and were able to adjust their product lines, their marketing, their sales distribution channels, they'd still be competitive, right? Adidas is doing really well in China right now, while Nike isn't. You're still seeing reasonably good sales for KFC, even though they are selling Western food rather than Chinese food. So the idea is you need to understand what the Chinese consumer wants. At the end of the day, China is the next China for most Western brands. You just have to really understand the political risk and what consumers want. China is no longer the no-brainer investment destination it was 10 years ago.
It is about making a choice. Do you want to align more closely with China's economic sphere or America's? The world is increasingly dividing between the US and China. No government or company is immune to the escalating tensions between these two superpowers. Thank you, listeners. If you like the show, please leave a review. And if you'd like to come on the show, connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find more details in the show notes. That's it for now. Cheers.